Chris Watts handcuffed and head down in court on Tuesday as he was charged with the premeditated murders of his pregnant wife Shanann and their two little girls Bella and Celeste.
Raw drama in court as the cold-hearted killer who murdered his pregnant wife and two daughters is sentenced. The father of slain Shanann Watts gave an emotional statement venting his anger and grief.
You heartless monster, you have no heart or feelings or love. Prison is too good for you. This is hard to say, but may God have mercy on your soul.
Shanann's mother reminded Watts of a heartbreaking video his daughter Bella recorded.
My daddy is a hero. He helps me grow up strong.
We loved you like a son. We trusted you. Your faithful wife trusted you. Your children adored you.
The DA revealed gruesome new details about the murders. As Watts strangled his wife, it would have taken up to 4 minutes to end her life. Then he smothered his two daughters. 4-year-old Bella fought back as her dad was killing her. Even more shocking, just hours after burying his wife and dumping his daughter's bodies in oil tanks, he was back with his co-workers, acting as if nothing had happened. Nothing had happened. Nothing had happened.
From the haunted heartland in Omaha, Nebraska, my name is Brian Corey, and I welcome you to this episode of the Necronomicast. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome to the program a licensed psychotherapist and clinical instructor from George Washington School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. Her name is Lena Derhally. She's the author of the #1 bestseller, My Daddy is a Hero: How Chris Watts Went from Family Man to Family Killer. Now, this is no ordinary true crime book. It's a fascinating and riveting account of the 2018 murders of a Colorado family that shocked and saddened the nation. In this episode, Lena's going to help us understand sociopathic, psychopathic, and narcissistic personality disorders that lead to these unspeakable crimes and how they can remain hidden from view until it's far too late. So, I invite you to dim the lights and relax as I welcome Lena Derhally for a late night conversation. Joining me now on the Necronomicast hotline, licensed psychotherapist and clinical instructor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at the George Washington School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., Lena Derhally. How are you, Lena?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Brian.
I've been anticipating this interview, this conversation with you for a while now, and I usually like to say, like, I'm really excited to talk to so-and-so, and I am very appreciative of your time, but given the subject matter, I don't know if I want to say that I'm excited to talk to you, because you've written this book, My Daddy is a Hero: How Chris Watts Went from Family Man to Family Killer, and it's an incredible read, and I'm very happy that you were able to have this conversation with me tonight.
Thank you. That's very flattering to hear, and I really appreciate you saying that. And I understand that it is weird to talk about a book like this. Sometimes people will say in a review, this is a really great read, but I also feel bad saying that because this is about real people. And that, that's the thing we always have to remember, unfortunately, is that this really did happen.
Yeah. And just so my listeners know, they're well aware that I'm underqualified to talk to you about this, but if you want to just kind of tell us about your qualifications, that you are qualified to talk about this, that'd be great.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, yes, I'm a licensed psychotherapist in Washington, D.C. I've been in practice for over 10 years, but pretty much I've been, over 10 years includes doing, clinical internships and residencies and things like that. And I am certified in something called Imago relationship therapy, which is a little bit in a part of my book. And that is an expertise in a lot of couples work, but we also work with singles and a lot of relational type of work. And then I'm on hiatus now at GW Medical School, but I was there on a volunteer basis helping mentor the medical students there. So that would involve giving them support and also mentoring them on bedside manner. and things of that nature. So that's a big part of my expertise and how I wrote this book, framed from that lens.
And I just want to make sure that I thank you in advance for your patience with me, a layman, as we talk about these different kinds of personality disorders and how they are diagnosed and everything that goes along with that in this discussion tonight.
Yes. And, the thing about diagnosis is it's hard. And, what I wanted to do with this book is not necessarily diagnose anyone or even Chris Watts. And some of the things we discussed in the book, like psychopathy or sociopathy, those aren't actual real clinical diagnoses anyway. But I thought it was important to sort of put out a bunch of different possibilities of what could be going on in the mind of somebody who does something like this. And I'd like the readers actually to read it. And, just as I say to my clients in my therapy practice, if it makes sense to you, great. If it doesn't, you don't have to take it. It's just a lot of my educated opinions and interviews with a lot of experts in the field as well. So I had interviewed a criminal psychologist who did her dissertation on what she called community psychopaths. And I also interviewed a neuroscientist who studies rage in the brain and what it means to snap. And then I interviewed a journalist who wrote a book on the art of duping because she was duped by a con man. So she did a whole book on the psychology of duping.
Incredibly fascinating. Like your book, what was interesting about it, you go through the events leading up to Monday, August 13th, 2018. And you give us wonderful background on the people that are involved, the victims and the families and the community. And then we talk about the trial. You go through the trial and how the detective work played such a huge role in bringing this case to national attention. And then there's a lot where you talk about the terms and everything involved with his personality traits and the personality traits of people that go on to commit these crimes. And so that, I don't know which part of the book for me was more chilling. Obviously, the crime was horrible to read about. I remember it when it was kind of unfolding in front of the national media back in 2018, not that long ago. But also just reading about the diagnosis, or maybe not diagnosis, but the classification of different personality disorders. It's a very informative read, but also heartbreaking with a human touch. For you personally, as a wife and mother, how hard was it for you to kind of research and write this book?
It was very difficult. I think, I was so compelled to do it. I was so drawn to this case. I had some personal reasons for being drawn to this case. One was that I was in a relationship with a narcissist myself back in my 20s. I was young, but it scarred me so much that it sort of set me on a career path to try to identify signs in people that could be capable of maybe not murder, but being incredibly psychologically abusive. And so this case really struck me because, and I think this is one of the reasons it struck so many people and struck a chord with them, is that Chris Watts, this guy, seemed to have none of these signs that I spent so much time researching in my own life and with, in my clients' lives and people who come to me with a relationship that something's just not quite right. And with Chris Watts, what was so, fascinating at the same time frightening about him is that he didn't show any of these signs until about 8 years after he and his wife had started dating. They had been married for 6. And so that was a really scary concept for me to think how somebody could hide this side of themselves for 8 years and portray the exact opposite of who they were who they actually really were deep down inside. So he had created this, again, in my opinion, he had created this entire false persona of this really good, trustworthy, passive guy. And he was kind of the opposite profile, of what we would see with somebody who usually is arrested for committing these type of crimes. They usually have a restraining order or at least a history of being controlling. And Chris Watts was the opposite of that. But in terms of having to write about the horrific deaths of these children and the trauma that these little girls, he had, for your listeners who don't know, he had a 3-year and 4-year-old daughter who he smothered and put in oil tanks at the oil site in where he worked. And then his wife was about 15 weeks pregnant with a boy at the time. And he had strangled her and buried her in a shallow grave not far from the oil tanks. And, to this day, I actually can't read. I can't read my own book. It's really difficult just because of the subject matter. So I think while I was writing it, I disassociated from the subject matter, because if you really think about it, it's too distressing. At the same time, I thank you very much for saying that there was a human element to this book, because I really wanted people to feel how, the humanity of these victims. And that required me to sort of put myself in their shoes. And so when I was writing about Shanann's perspective, as she's starting to realize something is going on with her husband, I would feel anxiety as I was writing from her perspective. And so those parts of trying to feel and putting myself in the shoes of each person in this story, it does cause a lot of anxiety and distress. And I think it was so overwhelming that, again, I won't even look at my book. I'll talk about it, but I won't look at it, and I won't go and read it. And I try not to dwell on the details.
As a husband and a father myself, I watched the Netflix documentary that came out recently, and then went to your book to kind of understand a little bit more about what actually happened, because it is such a strange case. I mean, as we go back and we start talking about the events of August 13th, 2018 and leading up to it, like you said, there were no real red flags. There was nothing. It seemed like this relationship just it had been kind of steadily declining, but it really fell apart, unraveled in just a matter of weeks, like 5 weeks, it seems like. I know things led up to it, but that's not usually the case, is it?
It's not normal. It's very abnormal. And that's exactly what I want to highlight in this book. I want this book to be an education for people. There's a group of people out there who like to look at this case as being Shanann Watts' fault. And there's a lot of victim blaming that goes on. Some people will say that she, pushed him to do this by her controlling behavior. And I vehemently reject that theory. And so part of, writing this book is it takes an incredibly narcissistic person with a complete lack of remorse and empathy to not only do what he did, but to have that switch flipped so quickly. But that actually is a common thing with people with narcissistic traits and psychopathic people, is that once they're done with a human, they don't have attachments to human beings, not even their own children, as you can see from this story. And so as soon as they feel like they're not getting what they need, or the humans in their lives are not serving a purpose for them anymore, then they may as well be garbage. And so in the case of somebody like Chris Watt, I talk about in the book, the difference between a psychopath and a normal person is that a normal person, when they have problems in their life, they'll think of something called a pro-social solution to deal with that. So that would be, if you're having marital trouble, you would seek counseling or buy a self-help book, which is what Shanann did. So that, there's a stark contrast between how she decided to deal with the dissolution of the marriage versus him, where he started to plot murder because, according to several accounts that he has given, he was premeditating this weeks in advance. And so, it's hard for normal people to understand, but these psychopathic and narcissistic minds, that's where they go at the very severe end of the spectrum. So you can have, which we also talk about in the book, there's psychopaths and narcissists who are nonviolent. So we don't want to say that they're all violent. They're not. But on the very, very high end of the spectrum where it's most dangerous, then that would be a solution that Chris Watts thought was a good solution. And he also thought he could get away with it. And so that in itself, I think, is really hard for normal people to wrap their heads around. But that that unfortunately is what these very disordered minds think and do.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for starting by saying that this was a way to kind of set the record straight. I feel like your book really did try to set the record straight and demonstrates that these actions are Chris's alone, and he alone was responsible for the horrific crime. You know, you get on the internet and people are like, oh, they'll say something, you know, and there's victim blaming, or some people might suggest that perhaps, you know, she pushed him too far with some kind of behavior in their marriage. But this goes beyond any kind of he wasn't triggered by anything. It doesn't seem like this was something that was innate in his personality since birth, you think? Or is this something that's nurtured?
I believe it's mostly birth, just again from the studies. I did a lot of research. I'm not a criminal psychologist, but, you know, I did a lot of research on scientific journals and brain studies of psychopaths and narcissists. And I also included in the book one of the most fascinating parts for me was hearing from or reading accounts from self-described psychopaths, or they could be called community psychopaths. These are the psychopaths that live among us that never go to jail. And most of the time, you know, they'll never commit crimes. They're just people that don't really have a moral compass. They don't have feelings. And they call, again, people that do have a normal human experience, they call them neurotypicals. And so the psychopath is almost like an alien, and they know it from the time they're very, very young, that they don't function and operate in the same way that normal people do. And so, when I say normal, I say, you know, the majority of human beings have empathy, have attachments to people. So the people that don't are a minority of people, which is the good news for all of us, or, you know, society would really self-destruct. But in this case, the accounts that I had heard, you know, Chris Watts' mother had said that he was always hard to read, that, you know, his family never even really knew what he was thinking or feeling as a young child. He was kind of always this very aloof and sometimes even cold. I heard from certain accounts, you know, this very blank sort of personality. And he describes himself as such too. You know, a lot of people, I knew I would get criticisms because I didn't personally interview him. But, you know, I didn't feel like I needed to, because I had so much information from listening to interviews he had given other people and these statements he described about himself. And some of the ones that really stuck out to me that really highlighted this sort of psychopathic personality was he talked about feeling different from other people in the sense that he doesn't have the emotions that other people do. And he says this himself. And he gives an example of being in a grocery store and losing a child. And so, Brian, you and I know what that's like. Or if you're at the playground and you lose sight of your kid for a minute and you just instantly go to this total panic. You know, it's just an instinct in you as a parent.
Your heart drops. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a real fear. It's a real scare. Even for a minute, that 1 minute you can't locate your child is a primal fear. And for him, he said, well, if I lost my kid in the grocery store, I wouldn't panic. I would just walk around and calmly look for them. And I think that was a real telling sign, you know, and he gives a lot of these different clues about himself in multiple interviews. And he doesn't want to think that about himself. It's, you know, I don't want to think I'm a bad person. He also says at one point that he read about how a father would never do this to his own children. And he had to read that about fathers to be like, oh, a father's not supposed to do that. He had to read that and say, oh, okay, I wasn't supposed to do that as a father. And then, you know, another time, I think one of the most infamous parts of this case were his Google searches. And the one that I always bring up is at the time when he was having an affair, he thought he might be in love, I guess, with this woman that he was having an affair with. So he Googled, what does it feel like when someone says, I love you? You know, what does it feel like when you love someone? You know, those kind of Google searches. And so I thought, well, that's kind of odd considering all he did for the past 8 years with his wife was tell her how much he loved her. And you'll even see in those text messages to her, he'll say, "I love you to the moon and back." And I'll put 5 exclamation points by it. And it was just another contrast. His text messages were so effusive, but they were also a contrast to this very flat personality. To every single person in his life who was interviewed said, well, yeah, he had no emotions. He was completely flat. You don't know what he's thinking. He's not deep, or it's hard to get to know him. And so I think all of those are just some examples, but putting all those together, I think it's a pretty convincing case that he was probably a born psychopath.
Okay. So I have zero training in any of this, how to recognize any of these traits and behaviors. But I tell you, he committed this crime overnight, Monday, August 13, 2018. I remember going to work and checking the news of the day. I think it was that day or the very next day. And, you'll see a headline like "Missing Colorado, mom, kids, husband questioned." And you're like, oh, okay, there we go. And then I saw that he did an interview, and I caught the interview online maybe a couple hours after he had completed it. And I was like 90 seconds into this thing out of a 7 or 8 minute interview, watching it and seeing him. And I'm like, oh my God, he did it. He did it. He did it.
I hope that she's somewhere safe right now and with the kids. But I mean, could she just taken off? I don't know. But if somebody has her and they're not safe, like, I want them back now. Like that's what's in my head. Like, if they're safe right now, they're gonna come back. But if they're not safe right now, that's the not knowing part. Like, if they're not safe, last night I had every light in the house on. I was hoping that I would just ran over by the kids running in the door and just like barrel rushing me, but it didn't happen. And it was just a traumatic night trying to be here.
What would you like to tell your wife and your kids?
Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back. Like, if somebody has her, just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here. Please bring her back.
I mean, it just, you could just tell. One thing that the documentary on Netflix shows, and you write about it in your book, is that a neighbor had a Ring camera and was able to see the truck back up into his driveway and load something. It was the bodies, but you can't really tell what it was. But he's going back and forth to the truck early in the morning. When he's confronted with that, he's not a man that's worried about his wife and kids. It's very obvious. So these detectives, they spotted it, I think, pretty quickly. It's usually the husband or the boyfriend. They always look for the intimate partner. But it was very clear just to a layman like me that, oh my gosh, this man's hiding something ghastly.
Yeah, I think that was another crazy part about this case is almost everybody who saw that interview said the same thing. And I think that interview was also what caused the sort of international cult following about this case, is because it's also like you see this guy who's objectively a good looking guy. They were a very, attractive family, a 5-bedroom house in the suburbs, sort of had that perfect looking life. And, psychopaths and people who murder and do all these things, they don't always look like what we think they will. As we've seen, people think Ted Bundy is a really good looking guy, but it always is very jarring to see this idyllic life or this portrayal of an idyllic life and an attractive young couple, and to think that, something super sinister is going on. It's kind of an oxymoron to our brains, like here's this perfect looking life, but we know in our guts that something is really sinister. So I found that to be across the board. It's like everybody's gut feeling said the same thing about Chris Watts in that interview. So I always find it interesting when I hear from other people and they have the same feeling.
So the title of your book comes from My Daddy is a Hero, the song that I think it was Bella sang on one of their home movies. Is that correct? Yeah. That was the
title that was chosen out of many. It's such a hard book to name, let me tell you.
Oh, I can't imagine.
And I have got some criticism about the title of the book. It wasn't meant to be offensive at all. It was more about trying to capture how Chris Watts had fooled the world with this perfect persona, to the point where, weeks before killing his family, his daughter sang about him being a hero. And Shanann also often talked about him being, a hero and the perfect man. And I actually believe that she really thought that he was. I don't think she was one of those people that was portraying a false life on Facebook, which many people do that.
Mm-hmm.
But he really put on this act for everybody and his own family and friends. There's literally nobody you could find before this who had one bad word to say about that man. And he was, he seemed like this role model dad who was hands-on with the kids. He would give them their showers, and, he just seemed like this really great father. So, it's a chilling part of the story that she had said that, but it also drives home the point that some of the most dangerous people are the ones that we cannot spot. And that was the theme of the book. And so how do we spot these really subtle, dangerous people? I wanted to know, that was part of writing the book, is my own exploration of, can we figure this out? Are there signs? And I still don't fully know the answer to that. So that's the scariest part, I think.
That's interesting that you had a different, or there was different names being considered, because I thought the title is fitting for the book, because not only, how does a father go from taking care of his children, making sure they're bathed and fed and clothed and appearing to be as nurturing as a father as you can, to doing what he did. But then when he is brought into the detective station and they confront him with the polygraph and everything else, the timeline and just everything that's going on, he calls for his father to come in. Mm-hmm. And that's when there's the real break in the case, when he admits to something. Of course, it wasn't the truth, but he admits that he knows that they're not coming back. He knows that they're dead. He knows that they're off in this workplace oil field. But he calls in his father to console him or to bring him in. What's behind that, bringing his dad in to kind of start fessing up to the crimes?
Yeah, that's great that you picked up on that, because the other irony here is that Chris Watts refers to his own father as his hero. So there's actually parallels to not just Bella singing that song about her father, but that Chris Watts, his hero, was his father. This was actually the one person, if he had an attachment to anyone, it would probably be his father. That's the person he had some kind of a bond with. And that was through common interests, like going to the racetrack and everything. So I do think, when he brought his father in for the confession, if he was going to confess to someone, it was going to be his dad. And he also knew that in his parents' eyes, he could never do any wrong, especially with his father, I think. And so, he even, as you know from reading the book, I'm not sure if all your listeners know, a confession was extracted from Chris Watts, but he was sort of fed a storyline first in order to try to get him to confess to anything. They just at this point really needed to find the bodies. So they had, forensic evidence, because the investigators knew that Shanann and the girls were dead at this point. They didn't have evidence, but they knew that they weren't coming home. And I think they had a pretty strong feeling that Chris did it even before he failed the polygraph. So as soon as he fails the polygraph, and the investigators had at some point asked him, did Shanann do something to hurt the girls? And then did you do something to her? Most people believe that planted the seed in his head. So when he called his father in, he knew that his parents also very much disliked Shanann. That's a whole other part of the book. Shanann did not get along with his family. And so he, in the beginning, portrayed Shanann as the villain, which also, unfortunately, I think helps with these victim blaming type statements. And, some people still believe that Shanann killed the girls, even though there's mountains of evidence that says she didn't. And Chris Watts has fully confessed multiple times with vivid details of how he killed them. And, he's even gone on the record and said Shanann was a good wife in person. So even the man who killed them is saying this about her, that she was a very good person. But he really tainted the beginning of the investigation by just having this lie about her in order to save his own ass, excuse my language.
Mm-hmm.
Just to say that. But yeah, I think he also believed that, and he knew that his father would believe anything he said. So if he said Shanann did it, well, just like his dad did say, we're going to find a lawyer, we're going to do something about this. So I think he knew if anyone was going to be in his corner, it was going to be his father.
I'm going to go over just a little bit of the crime, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on any of these things. I want to kind of bring the listeners up to speed, and I failed to do so earlier in the show. Shanann left with the kids to go visit family. They're originally from North Carolina, so she goes for a number of weeks. She kind of works for herself as an independent business person. She goes and visits extended family for a number of weeks, and then Chris, during this time, he strikes up a romantic relationship with somebody that works for the same company as him by the name of Nikki Kessinger. Is that right? Kessinger?
Yeah, that's right.
So Nikki she knew that he was married, but he, of course, spins it that he's separated, getting a divorce. So he strikes up this conversation around the water cooler, around the office with Nikki, and they begin kind of a whirlwind courtship, kind of an affair, very quickly.
Yes. And it's not, I don't know exactly how long they had a flirtation. Like, they had been talking at the water cooler. Most of the time Chris Watts was out in the oil fields, but a couple times a week he did have to go into the office, which was where he would see his coworker, Nikki Kessinger. And, several times, he wasn't wearing a wedding ring at the time, I believe. He was, I think it had fallen off because he had lost so much weight. And so he was getting it resized because his weight loss had made it so his ring didn't fit properly anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when she first saw him, he wasn't wearing a wedding ring. And in one conversation, he mentioned his family. And I think she was, oh, you have a family. And he showed her pictures on his phone of his girls and his wife. So when they did start this affair, we kind of have a timeline of it because you can see the first email exchanges between the two of them sometime in early-ish mid-June. And in those email exchanges, it's clear that nothing's happened between them before this. The way they're talking to each other is like they're just getting to know each other. But Chris is very bold in how he's kind of coming on to her. Of course, he's making statements that he's this really straightforward guy who really, honors truth telling. You really can't make any of this up because it was so far from the truth. And, that from those emails, shortly thereafter, he went on a weekend business trip with Shanann through her multi-level marketing company to San Diego. And when they got back from that weekend, Shanann had made plans to take the daughters to North Carolina for about 5-6 weeks. Chris was going to join them on the last week of the trip. So he was staying home for work and to take care of their dog. And during that time, basically, as soon as Shanann and the girls got on that plane for North Carolina, he was texting Nikki. They met up at a park for the first time and pretty much went into a full-blown sexual affair from that point on. And again, it was really a matter of weeks of being with this woman when he started to plot these murders and decided that I don't want my family anymore. They're a hindrance into getting what I want. And this is what I'm going to do in order to get what I want.
And is that in itself kind of strange for psychopathic behavior? I was always waiting for scores of women to come out or different hookups he might have had, but it just seems like he was faithful in the relationship until this one opportunity with Nikki came about.
Yeah, he's in his early 30s. And, I had asked the criminal psychologist that I interviewed about this because I was myself confused. And I do know that with all criminals, there's always a first time. And I think for any criminal, right? And it just depends when that is. And I think we have a false distortion of what serial killers are or murderers are based on what this stereotype that killers are always torturing small animals from a young age or show these signs. And yet some of them do. You know, you can kind of spot people without remorse from young age. They call it conduct disorder before 18. And then after 18, it becomes antisocial personality disorder. But as the criminal psychologist described it to me, again, she said, you know, there's all kinds of psychopaths out there, but we only studied what we call the failed psychopaths. So the failed psychopaths are the ones in prison. So that goes to show that there's a whole world of psychopaths out there, probably way more than we even realize, that again are nonviolent or will never commit a crime. So if Chris Watts was always a psychopath, he just needed a situation for the worst of himself to come out. And he probably hadn't had anything before that brought this part out of him until that point. And so that's where it started to make sense for me, is that he was always this way, but he became a failed psychopath around the age of 33 when conditions were favorable for him to be at his very worst.
So he has this affair. It seems like a singular affair, and things are progressing pretty quickly. But she was also instrumental, along with another Nikki by the name of Nikki Atchison, who is Shanann's friend. Those two Nikkis together really kind of put some finishing pieces into this puzzle of what happened to Shanann and the girls. We talk about how Shanann went on a quick business trip, and she was coming back in the middle of the night because of a delayed flight. And Chris in the oil fields worked very early in the morning. So she had appointments the next day, but her friend, Nikki Atchison, was very quick to sniff that something was wrong when there was no texting, when there was no communication, especially about Shanann's upcoming appointment with her obstetrician, because her and Chris were getting ready to have a third child, a son. So these two Nikkis were really instrumental in helping the police assemble this puzzle, this mystery of what happened to Shanann.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting to think that they have the same name. Nikki Atkinson is really, considered a hero of this story. And I think it really speaks to the power of our gut feelings and all of us listening to our intuition. And I think also Chris, again, because he can't empathize or put himself in other people's shoes, he was really dumb to think that he's going to create, because it's believed that he tried to create this scenario that Shanann took the kids and ran off. And I think he had not had enough time to clean up his evidence. As we know, Nikki Atkinson, within hours, was worried something was wrong and called the police. And they did a wellness check and were at the house before Chris had time to clean up any of his mess. So, when law enforcement got to the house, everything the car was there with the car seats, Shanann's purse, medications, the children's medications, her phone, her wallet, everything was there. The shoes she wore everywhere were at the front door. And I think that's when, people realized that law enforcement even knew that there was something very wrong with this situation. But yeah, Nikki Atkinson knew that this was not like her friend. Her friend replies to text messages. She had an appointment with her doctor and didn't show up for it. All of this was so out of character. I don't think anyone in their wildest dreams would have ever pictured that this would have been the outcome. I think initially the fear was because she was pregnant and had health issues that she might have passed out and they needed to get in the house and to get her help. But again, as soon as they got in the house and she wasn't there and the kids weren't there and the car was there and there was no other, also in Colorado. They're not in New York City where you can just walk somewhere. You have to take the car everywhere. So the car and the car seats are there. Something is really wrong. And then, within days, they were able to extract a confession from Chris, and he told them where the bodies were. And so the case was able to be wrapped up quite fast, also because Chris decided to plead guilty to all charges instead of going through a trial. So that was the information was also publicly dumped as soon as he was sentenced, which I think was kind of unprecedented in a lot of ways. I don't think the public had such access to information like this before in a case, at least that I'm aware of.
And it also strikes me that this case is eerily reminiscent of the Scott Peterson, Lacey Peterson case many years before, especially Scott's strange double life and his lies and his treatment of a mistress, Amber Fry. There was a lot of similarities in these two cases, it seems like.
There were. Scott, I think, was much more of an obvious kind of suspect because apparently he had been having different affairs for years with, like, you know, he had bragged about, you know, sleeping with flight attendants on flights, you know, things of that nature. He was a very slick liar. You know, I remember hearing he told Amber Fry that he was in France, I think, you know, after he had killed, that he was widowed after he had killed Lacey.
Yeah, he was at the candlelight vigil and saying
that's right.
Yeah, he was at the candlelight vigil for his wife and unborn child and saying how beautiful the lights of the Eiffel Tower were while he's at a candlelight vigil for his wife and child.
Yeah, so if that doesn't convince you that he's guilty or that he's a sociopath, I don't know what will, because that's just a complete detachment and removal. Like any normal person with attachment, if their spouse or child were missing, they would not be calling it as somebody that they were having an affair with and lying and pretending they were a widow. You know, it's just really, really egregious and offensive that he was doing that. But again, obviously he doesn't have empathy. He doesn't have attachments because it was so easy for Scott to do that. I think what kind of villainized Nikki Kessinger to a lot of people about this case were her Google searches, because she had actually Googled Amber Fry while Shanann and the girls were still missing and was Googling how much did Amber Fry make on her book deal, which I don't think, you know, made her look very good in this case. And so even Nikki Kessinger, I think, had drawn parallels between herself and Amber Fry.
Right. I felt bad for her sort of at first. I still do. I don't mean to say just at first, but when she was when she was looking at some of these other topics on Google, you know, I can understand her saying like how maybe the media or what how treated Amber Fry or what is Amber Fry doing today. But to kind of look at what kind of payday Amber Fry got for a book deal, that was kind of suspect too.
Yeah, that was not great. But yeah, that was another, I think, thing that people really latched onto on this case was a real hatred for her. And part of that was based on the Google searches they had seen of Nikki Kessinger's, which were also made public.
Yeah.
But again, doesn't mean that she has anything to do with this, but it was a big part of the case was also people really angry at Nicole Kessinger.
Well, there's just so much anger to throw around for everybody. I mean, for when you're trying to wrap your head around why would somebody, you know, strangle his wife, strangle his kids, and not really in a fit of rage. You know, it wasn't like he came home and his wife was in bed with another man. It's not like something, you know, not trying to justify it, but there was no real inciting incident. She just came home from a trip, middle of the night, and they made love that night. And then a few minutes later, he's strangling the life out of her and then driving his kids off to some remote location where he pumps oil and discards them in this barrel system. And then his wife in an unmarked grave and just throws her in there. I mean, I as a guy, I'm just thinking like, where does this rage come from? And psychopaths, what pushes them to that point? Are there psychopaths that aren't inclined for violence, that will happily or just without care and concern just walk away from their family without a concern or without a thought of killing them? I mean, what pushes that personality trait to that extreme?
Yeah, I wanted to know that too. And I think part of that was I'm really interested in neuroscience myself. And I was doing a lot of research on what does it mean to snap? Because another theory out there was, well, he was so nice and he was so great. You know, he must have snapped was the idea. And I wanted to know, what does it really mean to snap? And so I actually looked at some work by some FBI profilers, and I interviewed a neuroscientist named Dr. Doug Fields, who wrote a book called Why We Snap. And he studied the rage circuit in the brain and sort of what drives anybody to commit a violent act. And I found this especially fascinating because apparently snapping isn't just, it can be somebody in a moment, having this point of rage and killing somebody. But snapping can also occur over a period of weeks to even months, which to me was really interesting. I never knew that before I started researching for this book. And basically how Dr. Fields describes the concept of snapping is it's a break from reality that happens in the brain. And what he's discovered in his research is, and especially with animals, is that in the human brain, there's 9 neural pathways that contribute to a violent response. And if something triggers that, it can cause a human being to develop a violent response either in the moment or over a process of time. Like that can happen over a period of time, which was also confirmed to me when I did some research from an FBI profiler who had said the same thing, that premeditated crimes of snapping are often done over a period of weeks. And so it's like this break from reality of weeks that's triggered by this rage response in the brain. So Dr. Fields identified the 9 neural pathways that trigger a rage response. And in his studies with animals, if they send something like through an electrode to that part of to those neural pathways in the brain, the animal would automatically become violent. And he has like an acronym for it called life morts. And some of the things are obvious. The L stands for life or limb, which means that if you are threatened, if your life is threatened or you're threatened with injury, it's a primitive survival response. Automatically, it will trigger in your brain to attack.
Is that like fight or flight?
Yeah, it is a lot like that. So there's 9 things that will make you violent, basically. And most of them are developed from way back when we were primitive, and we've adapted so much that it's not the same anymore. And so one of the triggers, I'm not going to go through all of them, but the one that I identified as being very poignant towards this story was what he called the S trigger, which stands for stopped. And so that means if a human feels they're being stopped from doing something or getting what they want, it will trigger a rage response. So you can imagine in this story, over weeks, Chris is starting to feel that his wife and his children are stopping him from getting what he wants. And so, with Dr. Fields' research, that would make sense that would trigger this response in his brain of rage that could be building up over weeks. He's being stopped from getting what he wants. And in this point, he's completely blaming his wife and children for all his problems, and he's looking at it very selfishly and very narcissistically, that it's almost like a toddler, if you think about it. They're the reason I can't have what I want. And it's very entitled. And that's, I think, what was going on with him. And another example that I think is relevant or relatable to all of us is feeling like we're in traffic, road rage. That's stopped. So if you all, we've all been there where we've been in traffic or somebody cuts us off, we automatically kind of feel rage, And so that is our primitive brain feeling a threat. And so Dr. Fields believes that if we can recognize when our primitive brain is responding to a threat, we may be able to stop some of this violence by saying, oh, that's a misfire. I'm not in real danger. It's just traffic.
My goodness, that's chilling.
So that's one explanation, at least, for why people experience amounts of rage like we saw with Chris Watts.
Now, there's so many terms that are used in your book, like sociopath, narcissist, psychopath, even Machiavellian personality disorders and traits. This is a decidedly non-political show, but I was reading through some of these traits of the different personality disorders, and so many politicians, honest to God, seem like they follow or check off a lot of these off all these lists. What is it about charismatic personalities, narcissistic people, and public office? Well, they're trying to be public servants, but I read down these things, and it's bizarre how many politicians that I see in every state of the union, every kind of race, every political office, every political party, that seem to have these personality disorders, for lack of a better word, a disorder, you know?
Yeah, 100% I agree with you. And there are narcissists on both sides of the political spectrum.
Oh, yeah.
And I have no problem saying that. And I think, it's also a known thing that there's a high amount of psychopaths in professions like politics, Hollywood, CEOs, they've sort of had this personality and narcissism as well, where they like to be adored, and they like attention. And you'll see even with some celebrities, even bad attention they like, it's like they feed off of it. And it's just a certain personality type. One of the main parts of my book was exploring the concept of what is called communal narcissism, which I also believe Chris Watts has a lot of traits of this, which is a type of narcissism where they get attention and admiration through good deeds, but they also feel this inflated sense of self around being a particularly helpful or good person. And on the communal narcissism checklist, there is one that says, they would, it's like a self-inventory. So someone would be taking this test, and one of the checklists is, I will be known for, saving the world type things. And so I think a lot of these politicians, they feel they want to be adored, they want to be admired. And one of the means that they go about to get this type of attention is by public service. And that's why there's this irony of people who are supposed to be doing good in working for the people, but they're also actually very self-involved. And, oftentimes I wonder, are most of these politicians really working for the people? It doesn't really feel like that. And again, on all sides, I feel that way. I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually think it's a big problem that we have, and that we need to hold all our elected officials accountable in the sense that they work for us. And there's too many people suffering in our country from poverty, from lack of health care, and I think that's a huge issue. And I do think it correlates to narcissism in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I was thinking when I was reading through these traits and getting to politicians and people in places of power, where they make decisions about, for example, like a drone strike that they know will kill some innocent people, or they make provisions in a law that they know aren't going to either help people or it's going to hurt some people in the long run, and how they go to bed at night with some of those decisions that they make.
Mm-hmm. Every single one of them has blood on their hands. When you talk about it from the sense of drone strikes, even that, there's so many innocent people that have been killed by drone strikes. And I talk about this a lot, the Iraq War, where there's probably over 1 million civilians, innocent civilians, who have been killed as a direct result of that war. And, when we think about it, can you imagine if that happened here, and it doesn't see, and most of our politicians voted to go to that war knowing that there wasn't really any really good reason for it. And this is what's happened. And the country is still completely destabilized. And yeah, if you think about it, for a person to be able to do that and go to sleep at night, they have to be somewhat removed and detached from humanity. And I also believe they rationalize it to themselves a lot. I think that's the way they do it is, they say, well, it's almost collateral damage, we'll save more lives by doing this, or, they find some way to rationalize it to themselves. But I don't believe they have a problem going to sleep at night knowing about that's something that's been done by their actions. Whereas if it were me, I could never run for office because I could never, ever do anything like that and live with myself. So that is a really good point that you make.
Well, and again, non-political, just looking over the events of the last year or so, protesting and separating that from rioting and looting, people that, for whatever reason, find delight or they want to experience the chaos of destruction. And that seems to fall in line with some of these personality disorders too. Just the delight in the chaos, or having a willingness to participate in destructive antisocial chaos too.
Right. I mean, there's a difference between anger with about injustice.
Oh, sure.
And anger
Yeah.
about oppression. Yeah. And then there is that part that you said where there are people who probably relish in violence and destruction and enjoy it. And, there are sadistic people who enjoy seeing people hurt. Unfortunately, there is evil in this world. And I do think that, there's a fine line between those things of, it is important to be angry about injustice. And if you are attacked, you do need to fight. We do need self-defense if our lives are threatened, of course. There are times when violence is justified, but you're right. There is a subset of people. And idealistically, I like to believe that subset of people is small, are the ones that enjoy violence and watching destruction and watching people get hurt. There are people like that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Is there any hope for psychopaths or people with psychopathic tendencies?
I think,
because what a horrible way to go through life. You know what I mean? To not have emotions or being able to interconnect with human beings in a meaningful way. I mean, it's very sad. It's a horrible thing.
Yeah, and it's actually, if you look at it as it's a problem within their brain, and we do have MRIs of brains that show they just don't produce that type of empathy or attachment in their brains. It is sad. It's not their fault. And at the same time, when I was talking to Dr. Fields about the rage response, we also both agreed that accountability is so important and choice is important. So we all, even if they have limited capacity for empathy, clearly, again, there's psychopaths and narcissists who make choices not to murder people. And so from the experts I've interviewed and in my own research, narcissism and psychopathy can also be thought of on a spectrum. And so, obviously, if the spectrum is 1 to 10 and you're on the 10 side, that would be like the really malignant, murderous, violent type. You could say people like a 6 or a 7 on the narcissism psychopathy scale, maybe around there. There is room for improvement. And there are people who are self-described narcissists and psychopaths who do have insight and self-awareness and don't want to be like that and actually do work on themselves. And I think it's pretty easy to tell the difference between the two because the ones who do want to work on themselves are very forthcoming about it and kind of know what they are and are kind of grateful to be able to label themselves and also work on themselves because empathy can be taught. It's hard and it can take years for people who have really limited capacity for it, but it can be taught. But then those people really on the severe end of the spectrum, those people are very dangerous. And most often the advice I give to people when they come to me and they say, well, this person doesn't want to work on themselves and they're horribly abusive, then my advice is generally run as fast as you can, because if they have no interest in growing or wanting to change anything about them, it's not going to happen. And some people just, again, are very, very far on the dangerous side of the spectrum.
My goodness. It's entirely frightening, but very fascinating too. And, in the moments that we have remaining here for this conversation, I just wanted to thank you for joining me tonight, talking about this horrific crime, but also kind of the thoughts scientifically behind it of why things like this might happen. And the brain will never figure out the complexity, I think, of the brain and everything that goes on with, how we conform to society and how we treat other human beings. But I just really wanted to reiterate once again that I thought you did a great job in writing this book. I read a lot of true crime books, but I thought you did a superb job of making sure that the proper focus of this was that Shanann and the girls were truly victims in all of this. I really wanted to make that point again because you did such a wonderful job humanly writing this book and letting us know about her life and about her and what Chris did to them, not because of them.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was my main goal in writing this book, was to honor them, that their lives mattered. They still do, that they were victims. And that was a huge goal in writing this book. So it really means a lot to me. I'm a little bit choked up now, Brian. Thank you.
Oh, well, I really mean it. Honest to God. Do you have anything else that you're thinking about writing about? Any other kind of any books with your unique perspective?
I am, and it's kind of in the works right now. So I haven't signed any contracts or anything yet, but I've been developing a concept for several months now, and it's not true crime, but it is related to this. It's actually quite relevant to everything we're seeing in the world, and it's going to be about connections between narcissism and social media. So hopefully that will be something that will be in the works pretty soon. We'll see what happens.
Well, that sounds very, very timely and very and very interesting. And once again, Lena, thank you so much for joining me with this conversation this evening. I found it super informative, very personable. And I hope everybody out there listening really got some good out of it. And I thank you so much for appearing on the program tonight.
And thank you so much for having me on this and giving me a platform to continue to share awareness about this. I really, really appreciate it.
There we go, everybody. Another episode of the Necronomicast is in the can. I really enjoyed talking to Lena. Her book is fantastic. And if you think that we talked a lot about the book and you don't need to go pick it up because you've heard the whole story, no, that is not the case whatsoever. It's crazy to think that there's all these crazy people out there. It's like Chris Rock said, whatever happened to just being crazy?
Whatever happened to crazy?
And I had to bring up politicians. Oh my God, they're all nuts. Every single one of them. I don't care who you like. They're insane. Every single one. That was episode number 193 of the Necronomicast. Next will be episode number 194. Believe you me, it's on its way. So thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you're going to the YouTube channel, wasting your day at work listening to the Necronomicast. Click subscribe, would you please? Leave us a review over at iTunes, the podcast app, Spotify. Have fun, everybody. Now go get some sleep.